Mute. Hello, and welcome to the final installation of Food for Thought, our environmental compliance outreach series for Vermont's food and beverage processors and manufacturers. Today we'll be talking about hazardous waste in food and beverage manufacturing with Lynn Metcalf. Be sure to check our website. All of our webinars from this week will be posted online for you to download and listen to and watch in the convenience of your own home or office. I'd like to remind you that we also have 2 roundtables coming up, one in Rutland on September the 13th and another in St. Albans on September the 15th. All of these are offered through the Environmental Assistance Office at ANR. We provide free and confidential environmental assistance to businesses and residents throughout the state of Vermont, as well as recognition award programs for doing better environmentally. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lynn Metcalf, who's going to talk to you today about hazardous waste.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Metcalf, a pollution prevention specialist with the Environmental Assistance Office. Today I will provide an introduction to the Vermont Hazardous Waste Management Regulations with an emphasis on how they apply to food and beverage manufacturing and processing facilities. To give you an overview of my presentation, first I'll talk about what hazardous waste is and how you can determine if your facility produces hazardous waste. And then I'll go over the regulatory requirements that hazardous waste facilities must follow to manage hazardous waste safely and in compliance with the regulations. What is hazardous waste? Hazardous waste is, first of all, waste. Not a material you are going to use or a product you produce. It is something that has minimal value to you. Hazardous waste is waste that is potentially harmful to human health and the environment if mismanaged. Hazardous waste is specifically defined by EPA in the federal regulations and in Vermont in the Vermont Hazardous Waste Management Regulations. And there's a link provided. EPA has authorized Vermont to administer the hazardous waste regulations in Vermont. So Vermont has their own specific regulations that are at least as stringent as the federal regulations, and in some cases more stringent. So before I go into more about how you determine if you have hazardous waste, I'm going to give you a few examples of common food and beverage processing activities that may generate hazardous waste. So the activity of process equipment cleaning may use acids and bases as hazardous materials, so you may use them in cleaning, and if they are not neutralized or diluted sufficiently in the process, they may become hazardous waste. That's actually quite rare because there's so much water and there's so much interaction between acids and bases that typically they are neutralized or they're changed so that they're not hazardous waste, but just be aware of your hazardous, of your waste acids and bases. Another area where you might generate hazardous waste is in ingredient and product quality testing. If you have a laboratory to test incoming ingredients or outgoing products, and you use organic solvents or acids and bases in your laboratory, any waste acids, bases, or solvents may be hazardous waste. In addition, if you do wastewater testing and you have like a wastewater testing laboratory, if you have lab chemicals and spent test kits, they may also be hazardous waste. Another manufacturing activity that may generate hazardous waste is marking. If you have packages and you print like use by dates on those packages, and you have like a printer line, the waste ink and the waste cleaning solutions may be hazardous waste. So typically the ink is used up in the printing process, but often the cleaning solutions, once they're spent, should be evaluated to see if they're hazardous waste. And then the final area where hazardous waste is generated in food manufacturing is in maintenance of process equipment or process machines, as well as building maintenance. And this is actually the area where in practice we see the most hazardous waste generated, because the machinery generates used oils, oily absorbents, oily rags, and sometimes maintenance of machinery requires parts washers, and maintenance of the building may require paints and paint thinners. So how do you get from a list of things that may be hazardous to figuring out what if your waste is hazardous? So there's a process, and that process is referred to as making a hazardous waste determination, which is a specific set of steps that you go through for all your waste to determine which would be considered hazardous waste. And as you go through this process for each waste, it is important to document your decisions about if a waste is hazardous or not. As always, if you have questions, you can contact us at the Environmental Assistance Office. We'd be happy to work through your wastes with you and work through your waste determinations with you, or just check your work. So the first step is to look at your waste streams and ask, is this a waste? For all wastes, consider if you or someone else can use it or reuse it. If something is used or reused for its intended purpose without further processing, it's not a waste. For example, if you were a circuit board manufacturer and you need highly pure solvent to clean circuit boards, but once it's used, it's still really clean, you can give it to someone else for example, parts degreasing. So for a less stringent use, and they can just use it as is. So the key is, if it's used for its intended purpose and without further kinds of processing, it's not a waste. And if you have a waste that can be used as a substitute for a commercial chemical product, it's not a waste also. More information can be found about recycling exemptions and reuse of hazardous waste, or reuse of waste, in subchapter 6 of Vermont Hazardous Waste Management Regulations. And the important thing, even if you have a waste that can be used or reused, is to treat it like it has value, the same as you would a product. So make sure you're storing it properly and you're using it before it goes bad, or you're giving it away to someone while it's still usable. So if your waste cannot be used or reused as is, it may be covered by an exemption in the regulations. There are exemptions from full regulation as hazardous waste for specific wastes that are spelled out in subchapter 2 of the regulations. These are conditional, so you must meet the conditions of the exemption for the waste to be exempt. And the conditions may include things like storage and labeling requirements, or specific disposal or recycling methods. Examples include used oil filters, antifreeze, shop rags to be laundered, batteries, or fluorescent bulbs. The specific conditions can be found in subchapter 2 of the regulations, and we have a bunch of topic-specific environmental fact sheets on our waste site, www.eaovt.org. But just for an example, shop rags for laundering. Shop rags are commonly used in maintenance, and they may be an oily hazardous waste if disposed. So there is an exemption in the regulations for oily rags that are laundered through a commercial laundry. They don't have to be managed or counted as hazardous waste if laundered. So the other condition of the exemption is that while they're on your site, they need to be stored in a closed container and labeled appropriately. So as long as those conditions are met, the waste does not have to be considered hazardous waste. So if your waste cannot be used or reused, and there's not an exemption that applies to it, the next question to ask is the waste on a list? So there are 5 lists in the regulations, and if your waste is on one of those lists, it may be hazardous waste. The lists are named with a letter or 2 in the case of the VT list, and each waste in the list has a 4-character waste code that starts with those letters. Hazardous waste codes are used on manifests and other documents to describe why a waste is hazardous. The most common listed wastes are the VT wastes and the F waste. So those are the top 2 rows of this table. The VT wastes are wastes that are regulated as hazardous in Vermont. So before I mentioned that Vermont can be more stringent than the EPA regulations, and in a few instances, Vermont has decided to regulate wastes that are not regulated federally. So an example of that, which is very common in all industry, especially anything that has machining, are VTO2, that's the waste code, which describes wastes containing greater than 5% petroleum distillates. So things like oily speedy dry or oily sorbent pads can be Vermont VTO2 wastes. The other one of the wastes that's common in certainly among smaller businesses and in the food and beverage manufacturing sector would be the F list, which is described in the regulations as waste from non-specific sources, which doesn't really tell you that much, but each of the wastes on the F list has a kind of a general description. So for example, F003, that's the waste code for spent, meaning used, non-halogenated solvents. So non-halogenated means it's not a chlorinated solvent. So acetone would be an example. So if you use acetone for a cleaning process, once it's spent, it would be, or could be, an F003 waste. The other lists are much less common, especially among smaller businesses. Waste from specific sources. You can see the example, it's very specific. Distillation, still bottoms from the distillation of benzyl chloride. And the U waste are discarded commercial chemical products. And the key there is that they're unused chemicals. So if you have a lab, you could, and you're getting rid of like old unused chemicals, they might be on the U list. The final list is the P list, and those are acutely hazardous wastes. So if your waste, if you've gone through the list process, the final step is to look at the physical and chemical characteristics of the waste. And and a waste can be both on a list and have a characteristic. So even if you find that it's on one of the lists, you still need to go through the characteristics, looking at the hazardous waste characteristics. And the characteristics are looking at physical and chemical characteristics of the waste. And resources for this step include material safety data sheets, or now they're known as safety data sheets, that you get from your product supplier, keeping in mind that the characteristics of the initial material may change through use. So you still need to know what the characteristics of the waste are, which may require testing. And note that what I've listed on the slides are kind of simplified definitions. The full definitions are in the regulations and in a book that I'll provide a link to called the Conditionally Exempt Generator Handbook, which I'll explain a little bit later. So the first of the characteristics is an ignitability. So liquids with flash point of less than or equal to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Examples would be paint thinner, gasoline, ethanol. The second of the lists the characteristics is corrosivity. Those are liquids with a pH of less than or equal to 2 or greater than 12.5. So, and keep in mind for corrosivity that this is the waste, not the original product. So while you might use an acid or a base that starts out with a pH below 2 or greater than 12.5, for equipment cleaning. If through the process of use and the addition of water and the combination of cleaning solutions, the waste that discharged will likely be above pH 2 or below pH 12.5. In that case, it would not be hazardous waste. So it's the waste. It's what comes out at the end, the end waste that you need to look at, not the chemicals that go into it necessarily. Yeah, the other there's other two characteristics are reactivity, which are wastes that undergo rapid, violent reaction when exposed to water, shock, heat, or pressure. I couldn't really think of an example from food processing and manufacturing. One example would be like gunpowder is a reactive waste. The final of the characteristics is toxicity, and this is a group of about 40 chemicals. And your waste would be characteristic for toxicity if contaminants are found above specific limits using a test called the TCLP leaching test. So if your waste would need to be tested, and if it exceeds the levels using this TCLP leaching test, then it would be hazardous for one or more of these contaminants. And the toxicity lists include 8 metals, including like mercury, lead, arsenic, 6 pesticides, and 26 other contaminants. So an example would be used chemical oxygen demand test kits. They're pretty common for wastewater testing, and then used test kits actually contain mercury, chromium, and silver. So they would be hazardous waste. So now that I've identified hazardous waste, what next? So some of the requirements that hazardous waste generators need to meet are you need to figure out your generator status. So what is a hazardous waste generator? A hazardous waste generator is any person, business, or municipality by location that produces hazardous waste. That's like the official definition. So if you generate hazardous waste, if you create any hazardous waste, you're a generator. And so for each location that you generate hazardous waste at, you must figure out your generator status. Basically, how much waste you generate and generate per month and store on site at any given time. And that will determine how much of the regulations you are subject to. So the less waste you generate, the fewer regulations you need to comply with. So how do you calculate your generator status? First of all, you add up all the waste that you generate, not ship, but generate per month, as well as the amount that you accumulate on site. And keep in mind that you should not include any waste that are either recycled or subject to an exemption that you can meet. So if you have batteries, fluorescent lamps, antifreeze that's recycled, rags for laundering, used oil, and you meet those exemptions, you don't need to count those. And for Vermont listed waste only, like the VTO2, the oily waste that I discussed before, you can average that waste over 6 months. So only for Vermont wastes. Federal wastes, you have to count them in the month that they're generated. But for Vermont wastes, you can average them over 6 months. So for example, if you do a machine clean out in January, and you generate 600 pounds of oily waste, you can divide that by 6 and count only 100 pounds for the month of January, or 100 pounds per month. So then once you have the amount of waste you generate per month, and these are not exact amounts, we understand that you're going to need to estimate the amount you generate will vary month to month, but just make a good faith estimate of how much you generate per month using the records you have. Things like how much material you buy, if you use oily absorbents, how much oily absorbents you buy. Just make a good faith effort to determine approximately how much you generate per month. And then you'd compare it to the numbers on this chart. So if you generate 220 pounds or less per month and you store less than 2,200 pounds per month, you would be considered a conditionally exempt generator. That's the smallest category of generator, and they are subject to the fewest regulations. If you generate greater than 220 but less than 2,200, you would be, and you store less than 13,200 pounds at any given time, you'd be a small quantity generator. And if you generate greater than 2,200 pounds per month, you'd be a large quantity generator. And I don't even think I'm going out on a limb and saying in Vermont, the vast majority of food and beverage manufacturing and processing businesses that generate waste are conditionally exempt generators. It's just the nature of the materials you're using and the product you're producing just doesn't lend itself to generating a lot of hazardous waste. So that's a good thing for you. So what do conditionally exempt generators need to do? The first thing that they need to do is to notify the Vermont DEC of their hazardous waste activity. So in Vermont, this is another way in which we're more stringent than the federal regulations. In Vermont, all conditionally exempt generators must notify of their hazardous waste and used oil activity using a form called the Hazardous Waste Handler Site ID form. It documents hazardous waste and used oil activities, and once you send it in to the Vermont DEC, your site will be issued a permanent EPA ID number that's location specific, and in addition, you must re-notify when the information changes. Now, you may already have a number, so there's a place online where you can check. It's called either the Environmental Research Tool or the WMID, and we'll have a link in our PowerPoint, and we have a link on our food and beverage website to where you can check to see if you already have a number. So you can look that up in a database to see you may already have notified, and you may already have an EPA ID number. But if not, you should definitely check. And if not, you should fill out that form, and we can certainly help you walk through the form. So what are the physical requirements, the physical requirements for conditionally exempt generators? When you have hazardous waste on site, it must be stored on an impervious surface, for example, concrete or a hard plastic like plastic trays. It must be stored within a structure that sheds rain and snow, so it can't have rain and snow sort of piling up on top of it. It needs to be in the structure. If it's freezable, it needs to be protected from freezing. So the example on the left, those are what I would call drum caddies. So if you don't have space to store hazardous waste inside your building, those are a good alternative. They have a collection tray underneath, and they're covered, so the waste is protected from rain and snow. And they're actually, in this case, they're nicely labeled. They have a label on the outside as well as on each individual container. And on the right, the drum is being stored inside on a concrete floor. It's covered. And if the waste is freezable, as long as the building's heated, it meets that requirement. And if you have freezable waste and you don't have room to store it indoors, one alternative is to ship it all off site, or remove it, dispose of it in the late fall, and then just collect smaller amounts over the winter, and then you can move it back into an unheated space in the spring. Other storage requirements for conditionally exempt generators. All containers of hazardous waste, so anywhere where you're collecting or storing hazardous waste, containers must be closed except to add or remove the waste. They must be in good condition and chemically compatible with the waste, and they need to be marked as hazardous waste and with other words that identify the contents. So you may have seen like the pretty yellow and red labels. You don't need those really nice labels. You can label it with a grease pencil or spray paint as long as they're labeled as with the words hazardous waste and words that identify the contents. Containers must also be managed to prevent leaks, and so that if the container is in poor condition, the waste needs to be transferred or overpacked, and incompatible wastes should be separated. Here's some examples of good storage practices. The one in the upper left, the tank is labeled very clearly, waste antifreeze. This hazardous waste drum on the right, it's labeled as hazardous waste and oily pigs and rags. Now this is the full-on hazardous waste label. You can use these, they're easy to get from various suppliers, but even if you use them, you don't need to fully fill them out as if you're conditionally exempt. If you're a small or large quantity generator, you would need to fully fill them out. But if you're conditionally exempt, all you need to have is hazardous waste and then words that describe the contents of the container for while you're storing it on site. And this other example is this in the kind of lower left is a good example just of good storage practices. It's a drum funnel. So the funnel is screwed into the drum. It's a locking funnel, and it's actually labeled gasoline only. So it's very clear what types of waste can go in there, and that's a really important point to communicate what is in all your containers. Another one of the regulations that apply to conditionally exempt generators is you're required to respond to spills. So in the event of a spill or a release, you just need to contain the release material to prevent spreading if it's safe to do so yourself, and or call a spill response contractor. And then once that's under control a bit, immediately call the spill response numbers to report a spill if up to either 2 gallons or more, or less than 2 gallons if there's a threat to human health or the environment. And you also need to determine if any cleanup materials are hazardous waste. So there's more information on spill reporting on the DEC's spills management website or webpage. And one note that if you have a lot of hazardous materials or hazardous waste on site, it's a good idea to have kind of establish a relationship with a spill cleanup contractor ahead of time, so that you have someone who's sort of on speed dial or knows your facility and knows the kind of waste you have. And it's also a good idea to talk to your local emergency planning officials so they know what kinds of waste you have or what kinds of chemicals you have on site and where they're located, so they'll be better prepared should there be an emergency at your site. So your waste disposal options are greater if you're a conditionally exempt generator than if you're a small or large quantity generator. So conditionally exempt generators can deliver their hazardous waste to their local solid waste facility or a local household hazardous waste collection event. So first you need to contact your solid waste district, and we have the link to how to find your solid waste district. You'll need to call them in advance and find out what the requirements are, and you want to make sure that you're not mixing hazardous waste with regular trash. But you can also hire a hazardous waste contractor, or if you have other facilities that are larger generators, small or large quantity generators, you can bring your waste to a location owned and operated by that company as well, or that facility as well. So those are the basic requirements for conditionally exempt generators. I just want to give you some resources that can help you. I've really just glossed over, just really touched on a lot of the important points about hazardous waste and how you figure out if you have hazardous waste and what to do if you have hazardous waste and what the requirements are. But one really good resource is the CEG handbook, which is Conditionally Exempt Generator Handbook, which can be found at the link that I've provided below. It goes over in depth all the things I talked about and kind of all the nuances of the regulations, and it gives you some good questions to ask as you're trying to figure out if you have hazardous waste, and if you have hazardous waste, what you need to do. Another good resource is the Hazardous Waste Program. Their website is listed up there, and there's contact information for the folks in the program there. They're very helpful, and they would be happy to answer any questions you have. They really want you to be in compliance, and they want you to understand the regulations, so they're happy to help you. And then there's our Environmental Assistance Office contact information, www.eaovt.org, and our 800 number listed there. My name and my phone number and email. Feel free to call or email me with any questions you have on this presentation. I'd be happy to talk with you over the phone or come out to your site to help. And if you want more information served up in a all-in-one place format, we have upcoming, we have our food and beverage industry roundtables in Rutland on September 13th, and in St. Albans on September 15th. There's a link at the bottom of the slide to where you can sign up. Thank you very much.